Welcome back. Next up is session 14, an applied session with Maurice Uenuma. He's the Vice President, Federal and Enterprise at Tripwire. After this session, please head over to the exhibition hall for our afternoon break, and don't forget to collect the codes from the virtual booths to be eligible for a prize. If you have a question during the session, please type it into the chat box so Maurice can address it at the end of his session.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm looking forward to a lively presentation and discussion. My only regret is that I can't join you there live in person in Victoria. As you can see, the title of the presentation indicates that we're going to talk about how military operations and security strategy can inform cybersecurity. This is really about principles and lessons learned from those fields. I'll be drawing upon some of my personal and professional experiences and looking at how some of those principles and lessons learned affect how we protect systems and data, which in turn, of course, is critically important to privacy and security. Now, there are some common misconceptions when we begin to talk about combat operations and security strategy and cybersecurity, and they can be generalized as some of the following. The technologist may say, cybersecurity is primarily a technology problem, and we just need the right technology solution, that it is inherently and at its core a technical problem. The warfighter or the traditional military person may say that cyber is a domain of warfare. In other words, it is just conflict in a different type of place. The marketer may say that there are warfare analogies for cybersecurity, that we're in a contest or when we're engaged in bitter warfare against a cyber enemy. Again, those are all obviously broad generalizations and oversimplifications. The reality is more complex. Arguably, cyber is another means to achieve desired ends, often to thwart the very human malicious ends of those who may be attempting to steal data or maliciously infect and impact systems. Certainly one thing that is true, and one thing that I've experienced, is that that there are different cultures and different disciplines, that the military world and that security world, as contrasted to cybersecurity, are made up of very different types of work. The nature of work is different. Oftentimes the environment can be very different, particularly if we're thinking about traditional kinetic or physical operations in the military. Oftentimes the people are very different. What I found is that the typical physical security person has a military or law enforcement type of a background, with that type of training, with that type of background, with that type of mindset, which can be very different from somebody who is in cybersecurity and comes from very much a IT or technical background. So there can be many differences there in just the cultures that we live in when we're looking at these different domains. But as noted at the outset, this is about learning what we can from military operations and security strategy and what it can teach us about cybersecurity in turn. A bit of my personal background. So I was educated and trained at the United States Naval Academy, and then subsequently served for 9 years as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. This included deployments and time spent in the Far East, in Asia, as well as the Near East or Middle East. It included being part of the initial invasion into Iraq in 2003. It was both a peacetime existence, at least early on and initially, and then, of course, combat operations as things heated up in the Middle East. I spent most of my time as an infantry officer, and in the last 3 years, I was able to join our Elite Special Operations Unit, Force Reconnaissance and Marine Special Operations. And then after I transitioned out, I went into the IT services industry, working at companies like Pro Systems and Dell, before transitioning into more of a security focus at the Center for Internet Security, which, as you know, is an independent nonprofit that focuses on cybersecurity best practices, and then ultimately to Tripwire, where I currently run our commercial business in the western half of the United States, as well as our federal business. So we're going to explore some similarities between combat operations and security operations and cybersecurity. And really the first and kind of foremost feature here is the chaotic and complex nature of all of these. First, it is a contested field, right, in many ways. We are dealing with an unseen enemy. And by unseen enemy, we often see them, but it's late in the process, if you will. We see them at the last minute, or we see them from afar at a distance. We never get to know as much about the enemy as we would like. We're also often outnumbered and surrounded. Now, you may look at the U.S. military with all of our might, with all of our people and equipment and so forth, and say, how can you be outnumbered and surrounded in some sort of disadvantaged position when you're facing an opponent in another part of the world? But oftentimes, if we're the defender particularly, it is with the enemy's initiative. They choose a time and a place. They ensure that they are, in fact, outnumbering us, in many cases, many times over. And so, although we may be part of a very large military or in-country, in-region presence, those of us engaged in a particular local battle or conflict are typically outnumbered. The same thing applies in cybersecurity, right? We may be part of organizations that are well-funded. There may be the opportunity to tap into a vast set of resources that if we were to just compare the cybersecurity resources of a large Fortune 100 company or a large government agency against a single particular hacker or criminal organization, we may be in a superior position. But in reality, we are facing a broad world of many different types of threats. And so in many ways, we're outnumbered and surrounded. It is inherently chaotic, right? We are facing a very messy battlefield, and we're dealing with complex operations. Certainly in the military, we are moving a lot of people, equipment, dangerous munitions, effects, as we call it in the military, and we're doing so at night. We're doing so in a rapid pace. We're doing so in a variety of different environments. In many ways, that's parallel or analogous to the complexity of running a very large IT organization in a global entity of some kind of business or a provincial government or other environment. It can be hard enough to make all of this work in peacetime when things are generally going well. And so as soon as there is any sort of problem or issue, it can become a very chaotic and complex situation. And finally, there are many different variables that we cannot necessarily control. When we look at military operations, certainly weather, terrain are big variables. Accidents can happen. They do when we're doing complex operations. And of course, all of this is being conducted by human beings who are prone to make their own mistakes or to have their own idiosyncrasies come to play. The weather example is one I'll highlight as part of the initial drive from Kuwait all the way up to Baghdad in 2003. The entire movement of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force effectively ground to a halt because of a sandstorm. And that is with the best technology, the best intelligence, a highly trained force, and yet we are ground to a halt because of the weather. And so those kinds of things can affect us tremendously in military operations, and certainly when it comes to cyber, there are unplanned outages, there are software compatibility issues, hardware break fix, and so forth. So it's inherently chaotic and complex. And all of this has an effect on us as defenders, right? It is a profound effect. And it's important to note that any activity that we do of consequence, of any sort of importance, involves some fear, uncertainty, and doubt, meaning that we are doing inherently risky, dangerous things of consequence. And so that type of psychological effect is very normal and natural. Another effect of all of this on us as defenders is that we must deal with the fact that oftentimes the feedback that we get is inherently negative. The overwhelming amount of whether we know that we're being successful or not, we only know if something doesn't work. We only know if something breaks. We only know if we are suffering the consequences of a bad decision. Meanwhile, there are so many different types of requirements, compliance requirements, best practice frameworks, tools, options, et cetera, to consider. It is a tremendous amount of data to contemplate as a defender, as a decision maker, as a CISO, as a information security manager, as a compliance manager, or as a privacy officer. There are so many things that you have to consider. There is more to consider and more data to analyze and understand than we have time for. Meanwhile, we don't have enough people, right? We don't have enough people with the right skills. There's a critical shortage globally of technically qualified cybersecurity professionals. And I suspect there is a similar shortage in the privacy space as well. And so we have to deal with this kind of overwhelmingly challenging situation, whether it's combat operations in the military or cybersecurity. And we can end up in a situation of analysis paralysis, right? There's too much data. There are the emotional effects of the situation that we're in, and the lack of ability to think clearly sometimes can affect all of us. And so ultimately, the sum of the effects of all of this on the defender is what the Prussian military strategist of about 100 years ago, Karl von Clausewitz, called the fog of war. It is the effect on the defender's mind, a psychological one that affects each of us as we're trying to protect ourselves and effectively execute operations in a contested environment, and all of the friction that exists in the surrounding environment. So that is a rather bleak description of the situation that we find ourselves as cybersecurity professionals, and how that's similar to military operations and security strategy. So then the question is, how do we deal with the unseen enemy? How do we deal with chaos and complexity, with the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and ultimately the fog of war that plagues all of us? Here are some guiding principles and lessons learned for consideration. The first is planning and preparation. It's crucial and critical that we plan regularly, and plan rigorously. But it's worth noting this very interesting and important quote from General Dwight Eisenhower, who you may recall was a general in the American Army during World War II and later became President of the United States. He said, "Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." And I think that's very important for us to note here. What he meant by that, and what he was describing, is that the planning process is the benefit of drafting plans, that the plans themselves typically do not survive first contact with the enemy, to use military terms. And I can tell you that in our initial drive up toward Baghdad in 2003, we planned and we planned and we planned and we planned for weeks and months. And within minutes and hours of the initial start of operations, things started to change, and we were no longer executing things exactly according to plan. But that was in many ways expected. The plan served as an initial starting point. It served as a foundation for us to then be flexible in our execution, to then be able to take the lessons learned from the process of planning and the teamwork and cohesion that came from that process, and then be able to be flexible in how we dealt with the situation. So in cybersecurity, similarly, we know that we cannot anticipate with any sort of true clarity exactly where the next threat will come from. We will be caught off guard, and we will be caught by surprise when the suspected breach occurs, or we're notified by law enforcement or a third party of a particular breach or loss of privacy. That is to be expected. We still have to plan, because the planning process itself is what gives us the cognitive tools and puts the controls and measures in place to deal with the situation when it actually happens. Another key principle to apply here is excellence in the essentials. And excellence in the essentials is about doing the basics, doing what works, and doing it well. There are countless individual skills in the military, in physical security, in protection, and in cyber that we have to do well regularly and consistently to be effective. Many of these skills and activities are not the complex, new, or fancy, right? These are fundamental basics, like in any skill in any sport, and being able to do those effectively and well is critically important, and that is reflected in a team environment in standard operating procedures. And again, doing it well is the key, right? We have to be able to deliver, we have to be able to perform and do these basics under pressure, and we have to do it well. These essentials in many ways serve as wisdom at scale, right? These are lessons learned over time that then become reflected in individual standards, standard operating procedures, and the things that we're taught and that we practice. And so the key is to then be able to do all of this in a complex and chaotic environment. It is always very tempting, particularly in technology, to look for a panacea, to look for a new shiny object that will solve all of our problems. And in reality, it often comes down to the basics. And you see here an image of a Marine, a U.S. Marine at the rifle range. And it is about the most basic skill that any sort of soldier or Marine learns. And yet we practice it over and over again because under pressure, those are the things that really matter. In cybersecurity, excellence in the essentials is often about best practices. And so you see here images of the CIS controls, the top 20 things that any organization should start with according to the Center for Internet Security, and an image that reflects the NIST cybersecurity framework, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, here, down here, I should say, in the United States. And the reason that these are important is this, that as we look at the data, as we look at aggregate breach data, like the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, we see year after year after year that the vast majority of attacks exploit known vulnerabilities for which there are available solutions, there are available fixes and patches. They often have been available for months and years, and yet organizations are still exploited because actually successfully implementing those and doing so in a timely fashion to prevent the attack is the hard part. Poorly configured systems, misconfigurations can be challenging and open the organization up for attack. These are file systems, servers that are not properly hardened according to standards from these two organizations and others like ISO, as well as improperly configured passwords and access credentials and so forth. So it is consistently the very similar problem areas that trip us up in cyber. Being able to effectively implement excellence in the essentials through best practice frameworks is one of the best things that we can do to improve our posture. They reflect the top security controls. These are prioritized according to the data. It is very much a cyber hygiene focus. We begin with the basics, and then we build upon that foundation to improve and refine our security posture. It is based on data, it's SME consensus-based, and it's maintained by these independent authorities. There is an awful lot of data to support my assertions here. I will quote former director of the U.S. Computer Emergency Response Team at our Department of Homeland Security that said a couple years ago that 80 to 85% of all attacks could be thwarted through effective implementation of just the top 4 controls in the CIS controls list of 20. Another point I will make as it relates to military operations and security operations, cybersecurity, is the importance of trust and integrity. Trust is the basis for everything that we do as human beings. It certainly applies to any sort of large, complex operations. Any activity of consequence depends on trust among teammates for the teamwork to work, trust in our allies, trust in our equipment, trust in information. And really, trust is not just a singular thing, right? It is really systems of trust, multiple layers of trust that we build. And this trust, in turn, is based on integrity, integrity being the consistent demonstration of kind of reliable goodness. It is about trust in data, and being able to trust the data that we're sharing, having trust in the security and privacy of the interactions and the transactions that underscore our modern economy. So integrity is a key concept here for security that I want to focus on for just a couple moments. One of the key elements here is watching the target. And by that, I mean it's very tempting to watch the threats or to try to watch the enemy. It's often a fear-based inclination, right? We want to know more and more about who's after us and what sort of tools are being used against us and where the threat actors are and where they might be coming from. But if we observe the principle that if the person or thing or systems or organization that we are protecting remains good, then we're largely good, even if we don't know everything about the bad. In other words, watching the target and watching what we're protecting and ensuring that it remains good is an essential part of this effort. It's often not the most exciting work, right? It is making sure that the basics, the excellence and the essentials from a security and protection standpoint are being implemented so that the target, again, the person or things or systems, organization being protected remains in a good state. You see here images of the President of the United States being protected by the U.S. Secret Service. I'll point to a series of articles that I had the privilege of co-authoring with the former Deputy Director of the U.S. Secret Service, here highlighted, and it focused on the linkage and the parallels between executive protection and military special operations and cybersecurity. And many of these points I'm making here are reflected in those articles, which in turn reflect, among many other things, his experience as a career agent in the U.S. Secret Service. Let me give you a little bit more of a technical example here. This is central to the idea of integrity and integrity management. It also happens to be a focus area for Tripwire, who I'm presently representing here at this conference. And that is this: if we look at this diagram here to the left, and we assume that this diagram represents a system, or such as a file system, right? A server, an operating system, or a network diagram. And this is what it looked like before a suspected breach or before an outage. And on the right here is what it looks like after. How do we know what changed, and how do we know whether those changes are significant or substantial? Could it be a fairly low priority change, like a non-admin user being added, or a password policy not being completely consistent? Or could it be something that's potentially a little bit more of a concern? Things like new routes being added to a border router, or a new local admin user being added. Or it could be something of a high priority, and the need to investigate that is key here. New unrecognized binaries, hash and access privileges changed on critical files, new listening ports open, and so forth. And so a lot of what we have to do to be effective in cybersecurity is integrity monitoring, integrity management. That is, knowing what changed and whether those changes are acceptable changes, unacceptable, unauthorized changes, potentially malicious ones, and how and what that may mean for us from a security, compliance, privacy, and IT operations standpoint. Now, we can't talk about any of what we talked about so far without talking about human factors. All conflict is inherently human in nature. Cybersecurity happens to be a more technical realm or domain or environment, but nonetheless very much a human contest. And so we have to understand human motivations and human organizations that we may be dealing with, both on the defensive side and on the offensive side, the ones that we're trying to thwart. It's also important to recognize that human beings in our organization are both our greatest asset and, unfortunately, our greatest vulnerability, right? That the human attack surface remains the most vulnerable, that no matter how many technical controls we put in place and effectively monitor, when privileged users, when those with access credentials are subject to social engineering attacks like phishing, that provides an opening that we have a very hard time closing in time. So the human attack surface must be monitored, must be mitigated, must be minimized, and at the same time, humans can be our greatest asset in the sense of being part of the overall sense and respond part of an organization to help us detect and alert and respond to potential breaches and loss of or compromise of data and systems. So often it is very much about having the right people with the right skills in the right places. We know that there is a critical shortage of technical cybersecurity professionals in the world currently. It's not easy to find them, but we can leverage a number of different methods to improve the overall security posture of the organization through effective management of the workforce. And culture is an important part of this, right? Culture is how culture is comprised of the acceptable norms of behavior, among other things. And because that has such an effect on the human part of the attack surface, on our security posture, culture is very important. And in turn, of course, culture then depends an awful lot on leadership. Many of these topics are explored in a guidebook called Cybersecurity is Everyone's Job. This blue link here will allow you to access it. It's hosted on the NIST website, and there's an image of the book here to the right. It was put together by a part of the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education Working Group that I was privileged to be a part of, and we explore many of these topics and more. So ultimately, right, just to summarize kind of what all this means, cybersecurity is hard. It is a complex operation. It is a complex effort in a chaotic and complex environment. We must deal with many of the inherent challenges of contested spaces, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the overwhelming amount of data, the lack of information that we may crave in some areas, and ultimately the effect that it has on us as defenders. But it can be managed. It can be managed through rigorous planning and flexible execution. It can be managed through effective implementation of the basics of excellence in the essentials of doing the right things at scale and consistently. It can be accomplished by ensuring trust through integrity and integrity management from the system level through the interaction of people and defenders, and ultimately looking at our people and ourselves as the ultimate reference here, as the ultimate defenders whose culture and readiness will have a profound effect on our security posture. You can see here on the right a image of some of my fellow Marines crossing the Diyala Canal into Baghdad in 2003. It's a reminder to me that anything worth doing involves fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that daring things require courage, but ultimately all of these things are worth doing in service to our fellow citizens and those customers and partners that we serve. And so all of this is worth doing, but it takes that type of extra effort, extra commitment, and a focus on some of these principles and lessons learned to do it well. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to addressing any of your questions.
Excellent, Maurice. Thank you so much for that. We've got some interest from the audience. They've typed in some questions in the chat box, so we're going to turn it back to you so that you can address the audience questions.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, which is perfectly fine. If you have any, please feel free to type them in now. I will stay here and will be available online for us to address any questions you may have. As you can hopefully tell, this area or areas of intersection between different disciplines related to security and operations is of a particular interest. And so if you have any inclination to continue the conversation subsequently, please feel free to reach out either via the distribution list and contact information available through this conference or via LinkedIn directly. Would certainly be happy to continue the conversation. And also I'd invite you to interact with me or any of my Tripwire colleagues. Please come by the virtual booth if you haven't already. Would love to also delve further into some of the specific capabilities that we are proud to offer.
Well, that concludes session 14. A big thank you to our presenters and the time and energy they put into their presentations and to address audience questions. Thank you so much for that. Take a moment's break here, do a little exercise, sip of coffee, come on back for our concurrent sessions. Don't forget to visit the exhibitors booths, the virtual booths, collect your codes. You can be eligible for a prize at the end of the conference. See you soon.